Good morning, everybody. So today is what day is it? It's Friday, January 8th. We're going to be picking up where we left off, and with section 2, talking about the people who built the colonies. Right. So you should be able to see this assignment, which we're going to be doing. We're going to be filling this in today together, and hopefully you'll have this turned in. All right. Okay. So here are two of the big groups that really helped build these colonies, right? The family, which was an important source of labor in the New World, and many parents had lots of children very young. There were kind of two reasons that they had lots of children. One of which was that lots of children meant lots of free hands, right? Lots of labor that you could use to help around the house. Now, you may be thinking like the same thing, like, oh yeah, my parents, they use me for free labor. They use me for shoveling. They use me for cleaning the living room. They use me for cleaning the dishes, right? But these children back then had to do lots and lots of stuff. Like they were essential for keeping a household or a farm or something of the likes running. And that's one of the reasons they had so many children. Another reason was that infant mortality, or basically in more crude words, is that babies died a lot, and they died really easily, and they died for very minor reasons, like a cold or something. And so lots of parents had lots of children to make up for this fact as well. This isn't to say that these parents didn't love these children. They loved all their children, even the ones who they didn't know very long. But they were important for labor and helping build up the farm and the colonies. And then on the right, we'll look at slavery a bit more. Actually, we probably won't get into too much today, but we'll talk about it a bit more on Monday. We'll mention one specific slave today and talk about his story and how that sort of sets up the foundations of what slavery is going to be. Okay? Okay. So, the family in the 13 colonies. In order to build up colonies, family labor became very important. For this first one, right? What is an important source of labor in the New World that most people had access to? That is family labor. Okay? Family labor. And like I said earlier, this isn't that they abused their children or they took advantage of them, but the children were necessary to keep everything running. Without the children, it would be difficult to keep the colonies running. They needed these children. People married very young and had many children. The more children a family had, the more people there were to help out with labor. And typically, the bigger the family, the more successful the family could be. There were more hands that could get things done. All right? Talking about families, we have to mention the typical family. Men were the head of the household and acted basically as like a little king in their own home, right? What they say went, and nobody could really dispute it. None of the children, none of the women, really no one could say anything against them. And this is how it was for most of history, at least for most of European, North African, Middle Eastern, and Asian history, where men were typically the ones in power. There are a few instances where women were either equal to or had the power, one of which being a few American Indian tribes where women typically were the elders of the tribe. All right, but those cases are far and few between. Mm-hmm. So for number two, you could type in men. Men were the head of the household. Men were the head of the household in the New World. And men basically owned their wives, as weird as that sounds, their wives and their daughters. So if you've ever been to a marriage, or if you've ever been to a marriage ceremony, you've ever seen people get married, what typically happens is that the father will walk his daughter down the aisle, and then he will hand the daughter off to the soon-to-be husband when he gets to the end. In modern times, this is just ceremonial. But back then, it actually meant something. It meant that the father was giving the ownership of his daughter to the soon-to-be husband, right? He was now going to take care of her. And so when you ever see a marriage today, that's just a holdover of how it was back when, right? All right. So moving down, children were taught to read and write at home when they weren't working. Now, this is an important difference between Protestants and Catholics. Catholic children and Catholic people typically weren't taught to read and write until a little bit later. The idea of everybody knowing how to read and write is a very Protestant idea. It's a very Protestant idea. Remember, our Protestants, the two biggest groups in the New World are our Puritans and our Anglicans. Remember, both of them are Protestants. The idea of everybody knowing how to read and write is a very Protestant idea, and specifically knowing how to read and write the Bible, right? So children were taught this at a very young age when they weren't working. The main thing children had to do was work. But if they had some free time, they were taught how to read and write. Although schools would start to pop up throughout the 1700s, most children were taught at home by their parents. So most children were taught how to read, and write. All right? Most children were taught how to read and how to write. Wrong thing. Along with that, many modern colleges in New England were founded at this time, like Harvard University, which was founded in 1636 by Puritans, or Yale University, which was also founded around the same time period. We call these the Ivy League schools, any colleges that were sort of founded in New England around this time period, the Ivy League schools. So many universities were founded at this time, which were centers of higher education. All right. Moving forward, let's talk a little bit about indentured servitude. You talked a little bit about it with Mrs. Chang, right? Indentured servants. But we'll go into a little bit more depth of what indentured servants actually were. The idea of coming over to the colonies and starting over was very attractive. Was very attractive to many people in Europe. Many people did not have land in Europe, and land equals power. Land equals power. You'll see this as a theme throughout a lot of American history for a very long time, until more recent than you might think. Why did many people come to the New World? For land. Because land equals power. Up until like the 1820s or 1830s, if you didn't have land, you couldn't vote. The only people who could vote in elections when this country first started were white adult men who owned land. And if you didn't meet all four of those qualifications, then you could not vote. I couldn't vote. I am an adult white man, but I can't vote because I didn't have land. I don't have land currently. So if I lived back then, I would not be able to vote. All right. Roughly half the Europeans who came to the colonies were indentured servants, right? They were indentured servants. An indentured servant was a person who promised to be a servant for someone much richer for a period of time, usually between 5 to 10 years. And typically, this time period could be extended if the indentured servant wasn't doing a very good job, or it could be made shorter if the indentured servant was doing a very good job. So an indentured servant was a person who served a richer person for a certain period of time. And we'll put 5 to 10 years, usually. All right. And something that may be surprising to you is that many indentured servants were not like grown adults. They were young adults or teenagers. Very often they became a part of the family they served. So imagine if one day your parents said, all right, we're going to put you on a boat. We're going to send you to some family across the sea, and you're going to work for them for 5 to 10 years. And then when they're done, they're going to give you some land and some money of your own. You're going to start your own life. Imagine how terrifying that must have been to some of these children, right? These were children, like 14, 15, 16-year-old kids who were sent away from the families to now the family sent them away not to be mean. They sent these children away to hopefully get a better life, right? And a lot of them did get a better life than their parents, but it must have been terrifying for these poor people who were sent over, right? It must have been terrifying for these poor people who were sent over. After the period of time was served, so the 5 to 10 years, the master would usually provide the former servant with money, land, and or animals. And this way, the former servant could start up their own sort of life, right? They could start up their own life. Money, land, and or animals. Sometimes the servant would get all three of these, or sometimes they would get none of, or sometimes they'd only get one of them. But usually they would get something for all the work that they did for their master. All right, they would get something. Along with that, remember we mentioned this one as well. Most indentured servants were teenagers, so people like you, or some of you, and young adults. So people between the ages of like 20 and 25 usually. All right. Okay. And the big point I'm trying to make with all of this, right? What I really want you to understand is that most people living in the colonies were either a servant, a slave, or the master who owned them, right? Most people were one of those three things: a servant, a slave, or the master who owned them. Everyone was part of this system where human beings owned other human beings in some form or the other. Now, it wasn't a very malicious system, right? We see slavery and owning people as something that is inherently bad, and it is inherently bad. But these people didn't see it as a permanent institution. They didn't see it as something that was going to be permanent. They saw this as something that was only necessary for building the colonies. And it was nothing that was pre-established. The English people actually were some of the most free people in the world at this time. The English people, so people from England, they were the people who valued their own individual freedom more than probably most people in the world at this time. And they're also people who valued the rule of law, right? Following the law, having a code of laws, right? The English had something called the Parliament at this time. They had a very unique sort of representative monarchy at this point in history. So the English people very much valued individual freedom and liberty as well as the rule of law. This is why in the United States we have these values as well, right? In the United States, we value democracy and individual liberties and freedoms as well. And we get this from our mother country, which is England. England valued all these things. And so we sort of took that off of them. And that's why we value like courts and laws and individual freedoms. So, but something sort of started to change, and we'll get to that in a bit, where the English people started to, or at least the English colonists started to toy with the idea of slavery. And most of them weren't very comfortable with it at first because, like I said earlier, the English people really valued the freedom of a human being and the rule of law. So we'll talk about that in a second. What I really want you to remember is that this system of unfree labor of servants and slaves helped change the eastern coast of North America from wilderness into valuable prized land, right? Into valuable prized land. So for number 8, how did this system of unfree labor help change the east coast of North America? You could say it changed the wilderness of the east coast from wilderness into valuable land, right? Something like that. It doesn't have to be exactly like that, but if you get the main idea, then you're good, right? If you get the main idea that these people were changing the wilderness from forests and stuff into valuable land, then you're good, all right? All right, our final slide, the curious case of Anthony Johnson. Now, I'd be surprised if any of you have ever heard of Anthony Johnson, but he's a very interesting figure. He's a very interesting case study, if you know what that means. A case study is usually a unique event or person that exists that really doesn't have anything else like it in history, right? A case study. This is what Anthony Johnson is, and I'll tell you why he's a case study. So in the early 1620s, a young black man from Angola was captured and sold as a slave to the Americas. He would take the name Anthony Johnson. He would take that name. Johnson worked as an indentured servant. He didn't work as a slave. He was not enslaved. Johnson worked with the full expectation that he was going to be free one day, right? Until around 1635 when he bought his own freedom. After becoming free, Johnson would be the first of many black men to own land in North America. Johnson, like I said here, would even own slaves and servants of his own. But this wasn't a slavery based on color or skin color or culture, right? It's not like that. He wasn't owning, there was no big difference between owning a black slave because they weren't seen as inherently lesser yet, if that makes sense, right? So in early American history, from about 1600 to 1660, there was no difference in being a black person or a white person. Now, when I say that, I'm not saying that there weren't no differences, because there obviously were, right? Black people and white people, they look differently, they speak differently, they have different cultures, they come from different lands, right? What I mean is that there was no difference. I mean is that white people didn't look up as black people as being lesser, right? As being a second-class race. They didn't see that. Not originally, at least. This idea of black people being lesser than white people only started about 300 years ago, which is kind of confusing because we like to think that civilization gets more civilized, right? People and human beings, we become more civilized, more educated, better people as time goes on. But for most of history, black people and white people did not see themselves as better or worse than one another. They just saw themselves as different kinds of people. But something changed around the year 1700, the late 1600s, where colonists in the South started to make institutions that would make it so black people would eventually permanently become slaves and become, in the eyes of white people, lesser than white people. All right? But the important thing I want you to know is that black people, in the eyes of white people, were not inherently lesser, at least at first. So in the South, people started to import African slaves for labor between 1600 and 1660. Was there a big difference between being black or white? The answer is no, there was not. There was not a big difference. And what was the name of the African slave who bought his own freedom and would even own land and slaves of his own? That was Anthony Johnson. All right. So that should be everything filled in. Hopefully you got everything. Hopefully, if you have any questions, please let me know. You can always email me or send me a comment on Google Classroom. I'm always around. And we will start talking about specifically some of the cases that took place, some of the laws that were passed that would put black people into the place of servitude. Okay? All right. Well, I hope all of you have a nice weekend if you're watching this on Friday. And I will see, hopefully, some of you on Monday. All right? All right. Well, have a nice day, everybody, then.